What's up, guys? This is a continuation of my Linguistics 101 video series, and we're going to keep talking about syntax. Now, there's a strange thing that happens in human language where words get switched around, and it's really confusing for language learners, so hopefully this video will be able to clear up some of the confusion. Now, we're going to be getting pretty deep in this video, but I want to point out right up front that even if you get lost and you don't understand every detail of what I say in this presentation, try not to get too hung up on that. You should at least be able to follow the general concepts, so don't feel like you're going to get left behind if you don't fully grasp some of the points that I make. And with that said, here we're back to the concept of complements, which we explained in the last video. So if you haven't watched that, I would highly recommend it. I mentioned that complements usually give us a piece of information that is significant for the head that they're attached to. And just like a king must be king of something, if you're shooting, then you must be shooting something. This means that the verb to shoot is a transitive verb, unlike other verbs that don't need a complement, like to rain or to sleep. So in the example below, the noun phrase womp rats is the complement to the verb shoot. By the way, I just want to apologize real quick to those who have never seen Star Wars because you definitely don't understand half of the example sentences in my videos. But then again, that's not my fault, that's your fault because you've never seen Star Wars. What's wrong with you? Now, in the last video, we talked mostly about prepositional phrases that are sister to a noun or complements to the noun, like king and of Gondor. In this video, we're focusing on noun phrases that are complements to the verb, or direct object. And as these example sentences show, you don't always have to include the complement in a sentence. You can just say, he is the king, or I often shoot. But when you do include the complement, it has to be nestled up right up next to the head. So the first sentence in this slide is grammatical, but the last two sentences are ungrammatical because we've placed something in between the verb and the object, or the head and the complement. Remember that the asterisk at the beginning of the sentence tells us that it's ungrammatical. And yes, I know I don't say asterisk the way it's spelt. That's just the way we say it where I'm from. Anyways, so far our rule about putting nothing between the head and the complement works pretty well to help us explain the grammaticality and the ungrammaticality of the sentences that we've encountered in English. But as usual, French is causing a ruckus. Because in French you can say things like Je tire souvent des womp rats, which means I shoot often womp rats. And you see we're putting that adverb often right in between the verb and its complement. And it would be completely wrong to switch the order around and say Je souvent tire des womp rats, or I often shoot some womp rats, like you would say it in English. So apparently, while they were busy getting taken over by Germany, France forgot that you can't put anything between the verb and the direct object. So how can we explain a sentence like this if we're positing a general rule about syntax that says you can't put anything between the head and the complement? Well, if you don't know too much about syntax, you might be tempted to draw a tree like the one directly below me. And notice the asterisk. This is not the right way to show the structure of the sentence. Because even though the word order is correct, the structure and the hierarchy of the syntax tree is all wrong. And it should be obvious why if you think back to the concept of constituency, which I explained in my first syntax video. It doesn't even make sense for the noun womp rats to be the complement of the adverb often, because then the adverb bar would be often womp rats. And that doesn't mean anything. So it's not a constituent, so it can't be a node. Now I know that some of you are thinking, well, duh, Aaron, the rules of French are different from the rules of English. What's the big deal? Well, yes and no. Obviously, every language is going to be different, but if we're positing a rule about syntax in general, we want it to be able to hold true for every language. We're trying to build a very powerful theory that can be used to explain all human language. That's why it should bother us when we find a language that doesn't conform to the rules that we're positing. Remember, in the last video, I said that we're trying to devise a set of rules that can be used to generate any grammatical sentence in any language. So if we find a grammatical sentence in some language that our rules about syntax cannot produce, we need to revise our rules. Well, with that said, on the surface, It looks like French disproves our theory that nothing can come between the head and the complement. But what we see on the surface can be deceiving. If you watched my video on phonology, you should remember that words have underlying forms that are never actually pronounced, but they're there and they're real. And when we learn about the rules that are applied to those underlying forms, we can then start to make sense of some of the surface forms, which is what we actually pronounce. Well, it turns out that syntax also has underlying forms like this. Syntacticians call it deep structure, or D structure for short. And you can see here that in its underlying form, this French sentence has exactly the same structure as the English equivalent. The direct object fits nicely into the sister node to the verb, just like a good complement should. So then what's going on with the surface form of this sentence? In order to answer that, we're going to have to get a little bit more abstract. You see here that even higher in the hierarchy than the verb phrase, we have a T phrase, which stands for tense phrase. You'll also see them referred to as I phrases, which stands for inflection phrases, but the distinction isn't going to be important for our video. And in my undergrad syntax class, we called them TPs. So that's what I'm going to call them in this video. And also because it reminds me of a lot of fun nights with my friends back when I was in high school. We know that this TP node is there and that it comes higher in the hierarchy than the verb because we can actually see it in sentences that use auxiliaries like will and have. It wasn't obvious that this node even existed when we were only using the simple present tense because that tense doesn't use any auxiliaries like will or have. It's kind of naked in that sense, so the T node is empty. Now let's go back to our original question. Why does the French sentence look so different in its D structure than it does in its surface structure? Well, it turns out that movement explains it all. This means that even though the verb starts out right where it should in the deep structure, it gets moved up to the tense phrase in the surface structure. And this theory is supported by the fact that in French, you can only see this movement in the simple present tense. In sentences where the tense phrase node is already filled with something, the verb can't move up there because the spot is already taken. And I'm sure by now you probably think I'm just making stuff up off the top of my head. Like, oh yeah, the verb starts off way down here, but then it gets moved all the way up here before it gets spoken out loud, just because it does. But there's more data that can help us see this more clearly. And the existence of D structure and movement start to become hard to deny. To show this, all you have to do is look at yes-no questions in English, which do something very similar. You might have heard this concept called subject-auxiliary inversion because the subject of the sentence switches places with the auxiliary. And looking at the sentences below might make it a little bit more clear what I mean by movement because you can actually see the two word orders in their surface forms, rather than just taking it on faith that there really is a deep structure that we never see. If you're still confused, think about it this way. The statement version of the sentence below, the sentence below that ends in a period, is basically the same in its deep structure form and its surface structure form. But the question version of the same sentence is a little bit different from its D structure to its surface form. So what does this movement look like when we make yes-no questions in English? Well, you see here that we have a perfectly formed sentence in the correct order. So our X-bar rules don't have any problem generating sentences like Snape has betrayed Dumbledore, until we decide to make it into a question. Has Snape betrayed Dumbledore? Unfortunately, in order to explain this movement, we need to add yet another layer to our syntax tree, and that is the Complementizer phrase node. And at this point, I want to stress again that you shouldn't worry if you're not able to follow all of this. I know it's getting really abstract, and you don't need to remember all of this information in order to continue learning with my video series, but it will be useful information if you ever plan on taking an actual linguistics class. Anyways, now I'm sure it really looks like I'm just making up nodes that aren't actually there, just so I have somewhere to move my other words to. But CP nodes really are there. We just don't normally see them when we're talking about simple standalone sentences like this one. So we normally leave them out for the sake of simplicity. If you're not sure what a complementizer is, they're words that help us insert sentences into larger phrases or sentences. So we can use the word that to help us insert our full sentence, Snape has betrayed Dumbledore, into a larger phrase like the fact that Snape has betrayed Dumbledore. or into a full sentence like this one. Everyone will think that Snape has betrayed Dumbledore. And you can see that the complementizer is still right there in the middle. Now, just to tie everything together, try to see if you can figure out why this word might be called a complementizer. In this example, the little word that allows us to turn the full sentence Snape has betrayed Dumbledore into the complement of the verb think in the larger sentence. And now that we know that complementizer phrases are at the beginning of a sentence, we have an available node for us to send our auxiliary up to. Our movement is complete, and we're left with the grammatical question, do you believe in life after love? But wait, there's more! Movement starts to get even more complex when we make questions out of WH words, like who, what, where, when, why, and how. So for example, let's look at the statement, broken hearts go there, which is basically the same in its deep structure form as in its surface form. And if we want to turn it into a question, we change there into where, and we get a question that is still basically grammatical. Broken hearts go where? But we can still take it further. So we add in our dummy do, and then you undergo movement with your where and with your do to put them both at the beginning of the sentence to get where do broken hearts go? But that's getting beyond the scope of this video, so I'm going to cut it off here. Again, if you have any questions, please ask in the comments below. If you liked the video, I would really appreciate a thumbs up, and be sure to subscribe for more videos on linguistics and languages. So thanks for watching. I'll see you guys later.